And now we have a pretty mixed assortment of questions from Menti, Tina, right? So they're going to pop up here, but I'm going to warm you up a bit before that. Would you like to reflect? I'm going to turn to you, Henrik, because you have not been speaking before. On the previous presentations. Now, Babs van den Berg had to leave, but you could comment or just reflect on her presentation anyway, or the one for Professor Manila or Professor Tim Corner.
The basic reflection is that there are many terms and many ways that we actually work with these problems, how to actually focus on the grand challenges. And we have heard terms like competence center, centers of excellence. It's actually quite hard only from the term to know what we are talking about, but I was pleased to see so many interesting and successful examples that we actually can build upon. However, the comment that pleased me most was actually from Stacy here, from the question whether the SFOs will exist 2030.
That was a quick answer.
Who stated without hesitation, yes. And I think this is important because whatever approach we take, this is a long-term endeavor. We are creating trust with stakeholders. It takes an incredibly long time to do that. We are changing attitudes with our researchers, which takes time. So, Naomi, I worked with 10 years with Beck, and it's slow, but it's coming. And we work with recruitment, and without long-term commitment, there's no way we can persuade a line organization to engage in recruitment. So thank you for that, Stacey.
Thank you. Professor Manila, would you like to comment on the other speakers' presentations? Reflections.
It's been very interesting to hear the different ways and like as Henrik said, the different very interesting ways in which the same idea that, okay, what should the administrations and the funders do to improve the scale and perhaps also quality of research on sustainability. And it's really the idea that, okay, there is not a single magic silver bullet that would solve all the problems, but it's more like kind of figuring out what are the necessary things to provide at the same time the needed small push, at the same time keeping an eye on the academic freedom and remembering the kind of conflicting claims of thinking long term and wanting to get something done fairly quickly.
Thank you. Professor Tim Corner?
Yeah, I think what's been good for me is to listen to the extent to which we're all collectively in different countries and with different funding mechanisms and different ways actually trying to address these massive common societal problems. And it's not, universities have always been here to do those kinds of work, but there's a sense of a kind of collective endeavour, I think, around doing that and doing it in a way that helps society understand the value and purpose of universities all over again. And I think we've heard in different ways about that being necessary. I mean, Babs just showing her politician on the piano is just a sort of manifestation of that, isn't it? But if we don't try and do that, not only have we got to sort of tackle these major problems, and we've got a lot of resources, intellectual and others, to put to them, but if we don't, that we kind of, I think that universities could have been perceived to have been lost their way. So we're at this sort of critical juncture where we've got to still be purposeful and useful, but there are these massive challenges to address. So being too purist about our purpose would not serve that well.
What would you say is or are the main challenges in fostering the centers of excellence right now and also in the nearby future?
Well, I think that longevity and patience is a huge challenge. Mobilising ourselves to organise groups of academics and resources, change directions, pull things from one thing to another is very challenging in itself. But if you're going to do that, you don't want to do it for the short term. You've got to then let the fruits of that come to bear on these massive challenges, and that's not a quick overnight job. So I think patience, and that's at every level. That's at peer-to-peer level, it's at institutional level, and it's at government and funding body level. Needs to be patient for this, I think.
Do you agree? Is it patience or anything else? We talked about stamina before. That's basically the same thing.
Yeah, patience is of course needed. One thing which actually came up in discussion during the break is sort of the question of renewal. In certain cases, it can be either too quick or too slow. But really, the question of renewal, that we know that science renews itself all the time, and especially for these areas, it might be that the needed speed for renewal, which actually starts sounding like silly, that needed speed for renewal. We wanted to have the patience, but at the same time we want to kind of be looking at how the scenery is changing. It's actually now changing very concretely. We didn't have any snow in Helsinki this winter.
Not here either.
Yeah, but it's patience and change combined. I think that's one of the challenges.
Thank you. Henrik Smith?
I would like to make two comments here. The first is that the question of renewal often comes up in discussions about centers of excellence, but it should be equally relevant when it comes to discussing a traditional department or faculty. And if you look at it, actually the centers of excellence, for example, the Swedish SRAs, they are an instrument for renewal. So the whole idea from the government and the way we have worked has been to actually enforce renewal in a quite traditional university. And I can't see why this discussion is sort of more applicable to the SRAs and to the rest of the university. We need a lot of incitament for renewal all over the board, including the centers of excellence.
You're nodding? You're agreeing?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, universities have the a great strength of having been around for centuries and their subjects and their disciplines. But at the same time, they have to evolve and change, and that can be hard, can't it? So you're right. It is interesting to observe that they're instruments for renewal, and we should use those disciplines more actively, probably.
I'd like to make one more comment here about the challenges. I think an underestimated challenge is actually organizational, because we're working in traditional universities which has faculties and departments and other structures that makes all the decision. And now we are creating bridging organizations and try to create a matrix organization. And in a sort of traditional university like Lund University, it takes time to find the instruments whereby these centers of excellence actually can influence the long-term processes. It's quite easy if you have flexible money to do short things. You can employ people working with outreach, communication, have pilot projects and so on. But as you stressed, we want to also affect recruitments. And we would like to affect infrastructure investments and finding the sort of proper way to combine a traditional line organization with this is a bridging organization in a matrix is quite difficult. And I think that's a large challenge. And I don't know if that's a perfect solution. We need to find ways built on trust between leaderships.
Thank you. Let's take some Menti questions. And either one of you can answer this one, or any of them actually, because they're not addressed to any specific speaker. Is there an optimal balance between top-down and bottom-up initiatives for solving the SDGs? Go ahead.
I would offer balance. You need both. It's not one or the other. One fuels the other, but you need innovation, creativity, ideas that haven't been thought of by anybody. You need a space for them to come forward, but you also need instruments to foster the possibility of that. So for me, it's both probably in balance.
Objectives? Objections, I mean.
You can't do good science without having a bottom-up approach within your way of doing science at the university. So that's always required. The question is what frames we set for that. And even when we do sort of traditional decision-making, we make top-down decisions. When we decide about traditional recruitments, we recruit some specific professor or we put money in some specific department. Now we put money in a specific area. But within that frame, I think it's really important to take care care of bottom-up initiatives.
When we look at the students that are coming in now, we look at the younger students, if you look at research about their value-based thinking and how they want to address, put their ethics into their workforce, how do you think this will change this balance between the bottom-up and the top-down? Because many of the young students are activists or engaged in the topics that are really addressed in the SDGs. Is this an asset or could this be a problem?
I mean, I can say from Nottingham's point of view, it's an asset for student recruitment, that we know that our Beacons programme and the way we've been portrayed, into the public domain has had a very positive benefit on attracting students to apply to the university. So, they want to be part of these things. So, students are pretty concerned about their futures and what's happening to the planet and so far. Absolutely. So, if we're not doing some of these activities, then we might find our institutions are not so attractive to students. So, that's not necessarily the first reason for doing it, but actually it is part of the story, and they want to participate. They want activities to be part of and curriculum that are informed from these perspectives. So, I think it's a positive business decision in all sorts of ways, as well as a moral one.
Well, we've seen in many institutions, starting in Paris, that the students will not commit to working in companies that are not aligning their work with the Paris Agreement. So, Henrik, did you want to add, or Professor Mandela first?
Yeah, certainly. I think that it's an asset when the students are kind of interested and enthusiastic about the themes. But actually, this relates to, Henrik was pointing out that the organization might be a problem, and I completely agree. But there also kind of the educational organization is a problem. Many of us, I'm certain in this room, know that it's quite hard to organize the education when people have different backgrounds. I have a lot of experience in kind of bioinformatics education, which in hindsight was pretty easy. There were biologists and computer scientists, which wasn't that far away. But this problem that when you look at some of the SDG-related research and the idea that the university should also be educating students in this thing, there is this, that multidisciplinarity needs discipline. You need to have the disciplinary excellence also, but then you need to be able to understand what the others are doing and speak the common language and all this, which we know. And in education, this is actually, it's pretty difficult. There's always the problem of losing 3/4 of the audience in the first 15 minutes by just choosing the unknown terminology.
Let's take another question. Do you have special programs for the leaders? I assume that would be the leaders for the centers of excellence. Henrik, do you have special education programs, or I know you have a group that you're obviously the head of.
Initially, Lund University had a very strong program for the leaders of the SRAs, and now they are providing us with more general courses, which the new leaders of the program can participate in. So yes, we have that, but we also have to care quite a lot for the sort of development of a new leadership ourselves, because many of the things that are important are not taught directly in courses. I think it's an important part of the general process to foster a new leadership for the centers of excellence.
Such as
giving trust to younger leaders, such to work with the working conditions of coming leaders so that they actually can take common responsibilities, such to help to identify good programs that are not necessarily given by Lund University that can contribute to leadership skills.
Thank you.
We don't have any, at the funding agency, we don't have any specific programs for the leaders. What we do is that we kind of organize meetings for them to kind of exchange experiences in the problem and in providing them certain peer help in solving some of the problems, but nothing specific.
How about at your university?
Yeah, at Nottingham we have, well, there's a leadership academy for the university, but we also have a senior research leaders development program, which offers the opportunity for it's sort of for the newly promoted professor level, and they've spent time together. They also have time where they all go and work abroad on a project to one of our campuses. We've got a campus in China and a campus in Malaysia, so they go to one of those, do joint projects. They also have the opportunity to shadow senior members of the university, could be myself, could be the vice-chancellor or whatever, to come and experience strategic leadership. And that's been a great source of people to find to who may be wanting to lead projects. Our Centre of Excellence Beacons directors had the opportunity to go on a very senior leadership programme. It wasn't designed for them, tailored for them. It was for them to be among senior people and take on some of the aspects of leadership through that, as well as coaching and mentoring opportunities. And then we convene them, like you say, to talk to each other about their experience. And there's more to do on that, actually, as we learn more about this whole area.
More collaboration.
The more they can share with each other and learn from each other, and we learn from their experiences, the better, I think. So it's not like a designed program, but more this coming together to talk about it and learn from it, I think is very valuable.
Thank you. Why does it take so much time to create trust with stakeholders? Big questions.
Should I give it a try?
Yes, please, Henrik, do.
I think we often don't appreciate that stakeholders have as specialized roles as we have, and they are as stressed as we are as scientists. And we think that they would be happy just to read and be enlightened by what we are doing. So what I think takes time is for stakeholders to learn about realities of doing science, and for the scientists of actually learning about the realities of being out there working with the policy problems. And I think in the beginning, when we had the Beck environment, many Beck researchers knew very little about the policy environment, and it was quite embarrassing to be out there sort of discussing very banal things. So we need to realize that we as scientists, we need to learn quite a lot about the policy world to be able to talk with those who actually make decisions. And it takes a long time to create a culture where this is regarded as something important to do as a scientist.
Do you have any good examples on how this has been done from your perspective?
We have had deliberate educations, conferences and courses related to connecting research to policy. You can take one example, that is the Common Agricultural Policy, which is one of the largest investments in the environment in Europe, which is a terribly complicated policy where most people just think it's a general subsidy to farmers. But it's actually a very complex policy driven by complex agendas by the different member countries. And it takes years to get people working with biodiversity or with carbon accumulation in soils in agriculture to realize that, and then to be able to talk to those who actually can influence the future policies. So we cannot only blame the stakeholders. We have to look at ourselves and how we present our science and how we understand the reality of the context that decisions are made.
Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a large part of my job is about fostering very good relationships with all sorts of external and other parties where you're trying to work with, whether it's industry leaders or whether it's funding bodies or whether it's government agencies or whatever. And it's absolutely essential that you have that shared understanding, and fostering very good relationships is absolutely fundamental to doing it, to working effectively. We've set up an institute for policy engagement actually for the university in order to enable exactly what you're talking about, to have a vehicle by which the skills of networking, collaborating, talking to policymakers, bringing them in, seeing what you're doing, engaging with the public as well. You've got an expert. Said we've appointed a director who was a very senior civil servant in government to come and lead that with us, and of course has those relationships and knows how to operate in that kind of environment. Enormously useful to academics who, that hasn't necessarily been the path they've taken. So that's proved very helpful.
Thank you. How does recruitment of professors come into the centers? As I said, it's a big mix of questions here, but fire away. Who would like to address that one? You spoke about the cost of recruitment,
or the commitment that the university makes. Of course, all universities make their recruitment decisions using their own procedures, and it might be connected to the centers of excellence, or as was referred to earlier, it might be that the recruitment is made on the basis of some disciplinary classification, that there is a department of physics and a department of sociology and so on. But of course, one way of looking at this sort of or SDGs or something that the university views as important, it might be that it commits its resources by recruiting professors from that area, but they need not come into the Center for Excellence. They can come to the department but this is all kind of very dependent on how the university wants to organize its activities. So some UK universities, I think was it Manchester, they had the idea that education was organized this way, and all research was kind of in some sort of other style, or more like this sort of center of excellence type or platform type of. But I don't remember where they actually recruited the professors. Was it to the education or to the research lines? Probably both.
Probably, yeah.
So there is a lot of variation here, and it's difficult to say that this is the way to do it.
Of course. Henrik, tell us about how you do it here.
I wish there was just a single picture of Lund University, but even in Lund it's complex. But generally, it's the line organization, that is the departments or sometimes the faculties that actually make the decisions about professor recruitments. But the strategic research environment can then influence those more or less formally by having discussions with the faculty leadership, with the departmental leadership. And this is at the moment quite informal. And my wish as a leader of strategic research areas is that this would be more formalized, so that the uptake of the views of the excellence centers would be more systematic. Because if we really want a renewal here, we actually need to influence the long-term recruitments. And the SRI at the moment work with different ways to sort of stimulate this. For example, we can contribute some of the funding for a coming professor. But that also requires that we have sort of long-term guarantees for the funding. Otherwise, our guarantees are not worth that much.
Of course. What kind of dialogue does the Finnish Academy have with universities connected to these initiatives?
We have a lot of dialogue. So we talk regularly with the university, with their rectors, and it's really the mode of operation is that we have an idea that this sort of funding might be useful. I go to the Rectors Association and tell them of this idea. They say that they've heard worse ideas, but not recently. And then I kind of change my proposal a little bit. There is a lot of dialogue there. That it's not that the funding agency would know exactly what fits with the universities, and at least I've found it very useful and lots of fun to talk with the universities. We also talk with the unions of university professors, with the unions of university researchers. It's also extremely useful, because then they have a different view on the universities than the rectors have, and a different view than what we have in the academy. So we talk a lot. We just kind of changed this profiling instrument a little bit, and for a presentation for fun, I collected all the meetings we had with universities, and it was several slides. Really kind of working out that because then the universities have to write the application. So it's for the benefit of them and for us is that if the rules, regulations, instructions are as clear as possible, and they lead to the common goal of improving the quality, impact, and renewal of the science.
Dialogue with unions, is this something you recognize?
A bit, but more to do probably with the predicament of early career researchers who, as you know, well, I imagine it's similar here, but in the UK can have quite precarious careers, short-term contracts and serial short-term contracts, and then not necessarily having their careers shaped and developed in a way. And the unions are very, very preoccupied by that and talk to us a lot. So we're trying to work on better policies. Actually, it's better grant managers, the PR, we call them principal investigators, cannot adhere to university policies, actually, in terms of looking after their staff who are on short-term contracts. And actually, the funding models are not helpful for developing careers, really, because it encourages this repeated short-term contracts for individuals. So, yes, that's where we have interaction with the unions. We have got industrial action in the UK among our university academics, which is about pensions and working conditions, and they are striking at the moment.
They are. Okay.
Yeah.
Are conflicts between goals a driving force for development? We do have a lot of goal conflicts. We have identified several during the day already.
I don't know whether I understand the question. Yeah.
We can rephrase the question a bit.
Yeah.
Say that.
Are conflicts between goals? I think it's goal conflicts between the SDGs.
The conflicts between the sustainable development goals are one of the things that are really constraining the development, and therefore they are really important and interesting as research problems. Personally, I work with biodiversity issues. And see Erik Svetlicki here. We're always discussing whether green energy, that is bioenergy, is a threat or a promise for the future. This is a very interesting goal to see if research can alleviate this nearly impossible conflict by finding new solutions. So I think
yes,
by the importance, they become really exciting scientific problems.
And hence the driving force.
It's a driving force internally for us then to work with problems where we actually can make a real contribution.
Well, I guess revealing those conflicts through what you're saying is very helpful.
Yeah.
Because that's not well understood by the public, I would say.
No.
Or governments, probably.
Probably both. Would you like to add? No? Good. Any arguments for not investing in centers? It's okay.
I've heard them.
Yes, you can cite somebody else.
I've heard from purist disciplines would like to have resources flowing to them so they can get on unencumbered by any other influences, and there's an argument for that, actually. So there's a place for both.
Henrik?
I would like to link to something Stacey said, that actually the amount of money going to the centers is quite limited. There are mainly structural money for achieving change. The basic funding for the salaries for professors and PhD students and so on are often coming from other sources. So it's not that we are draining the rest of the university by having the centers, which is an image you can have if you have a naive view of what the centers actually are. And of course, my answer to the question is no.
Well, and on that point, the alternative is that extra resource just wouldn't be there. It's not as if it's necessarily going to everything else. It might just not be there at all. And is that what you want? Is that a better answer? Probably not. Please.
Yeah. I agree with the other panelists on here that it often seems to be the case when talking about research funding that specific initiatives, they are viewed to be much larger than they actually are. I once asked some researchers that how much they think that the Academy of Finland has thematic funding on our kind of basic funding. The true answer was something like at that time was about 30 million euros per year. And the suggested answers were about 3 times as much.
Oh dear.
So it's tends to be a lot more visible, the sort of the centers of excellence or whatever. And just as Henrik says, that the main thing is still the sort of the normal thing. And I think there is a certain point to that okay, we are talking about centers of excellence, which kind of the existence of one such. It's built on the assumption that there already is an interesting research area where there are excellent scientists working on that. So you need to have this undergrowth for the kind of free field of whatever.
So in a dream scenario, what would you ask for in terms of possibilities to strengthen your centers of excellence? What would be like a wish list? Pretend there's like a science Santa Claus you could just write off a list too.
Well, for me, I think it would be carrying on with the direction that we've taken, but you might also then be thinking about renewal and going into other areas. So the University of Nottingham wouldn't be able to afford to carry on doing that indefinitely. But it would be great to be able to have that extra resource that you can continue to push after the new and to really be driving after solving big problems and coming together around them. And people are already asking, what's the next generation of these to come? Oh. And we will have to decide whether that's feasible or not. So yes, my dream would be that we can have continual cycles of this, not necessarily the same ones, but to continue to take new and different things forward in a very creative way.
Thank you. Henrik?
From the leadership, I wish long-term commitment and trust. A thumb in the eye about keeping quality and maintaining a continuous renewal process. But I would also like to have some brave decisions that actually we could do something to affect the recruitment on a broader front at the university, so that we don't just try to implement the centers of excellence in a constant, non-changing structure. Mm-hmm.
Professor Melle, you're smiling. Mm-hmm.
I found these answers to be extremely good, and really thinking that okay, what could I add here? It's this sort of really the changing scenery that the centers of excellence should not be viewed as something which kind of goes from here to eternity, like the many of the disciplines have been around for this 400 or 500 years. So some sort of renewal, and really this idea also from the funding agency point of view that okay, also the responsibility of the funding agency is not to fund a center of excellence from here to eternity. But renewal, one thing that we've also what we haven't talked about today, but which I find of interest, is the question of what is the size of a good center of excellence. So the Finnish experience is that they used to be 20 years ago much smaller than they are today. So and we tried to kind of find out what are the reasons. So one is that okay, there is much more multidisciplinarity, but it might also be other reasons. And what is the sort of optimal size in a certain research area or certain research theme? We have had centers of excellence from about 20 people to I think 300 or 400, and that's quite a variation.
Mm-hmm. A good number?
I don't think there's a good number, because I think it depends on first what you mean by a center of excellence. I've been part of a Linneo Center, which was much smaller than the strategic research area I'm part of now, but we actually have different objectives. One was more kind of a project where we had excellent people working together in a quite restricted scientific area, whereas the Beck area is a way to actually target really large, complex questions where we need all these different disciplines that even goes across different universities, and we need to have a common infrastructure which is about how to work with stakeholders. That requires a volume to actually be able to fund things like that. So it depends on the kind of questions and how we approach the questions.
If I can comment,
please.
Yeah, exactly, and that's really the point. That okay, it might be that the idea that there is a certain like that, okay, when establishing flagships, there is the kind of idea that, okay, they might be about the same size still, but it's really that the aims and the goals, they determine, and the current status, they determine that what is a good size.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it depends a bit on the nature of the entity itself. But it might also be helpful to think about sort of concentric circles. So you sort of have probably a leader and a core team that are working very actively on a defined program. You know, you think of your sort of laboratory equivalent in an interdisciplinary context. But then there are concentric circles of individual players in projects, programs, aspects of it, and then you will have national or international collaborations and other activities going on. So it depends on what you define the centre, you know, but it probably has a number of concentric circles of close involvement and looser involvement with it, and that will include stakeholders, business partners, innovation pathways. You know, there's all sorts of different kinds of activity that are likely to be going on. So I don't think there's a single answer. I think that the optimum size team was, you know, what's an optimum sort of research group that can be managed? And there's a word that sort of like might be 40 or something like that. But we're not talking about that kind of activity. We're talking about a much more complex set of projects and programs and different related activities than that sort of, you know, core research group sort of mindset, I think. So maybe that we're making an important distinction here between that.
Henrik Smith, what would you say is the what would be the pros and cons of multi-party collaboration within a center of excellence?
I mean, the pros are pretty obvious, because by having more than one partner university in a strategic research area, we can actually specialize between universities and capitalize on different strengths in the different universities. This is what we did in Beck, where we didn't really have partners in the economic subjects at Lund University, but collaborated with Gothenburg University for that, and so on in different areas. So we can create a more comprehensive research environment and target the question we want to target, still then having sufficient critical mass at the different research groups. The cons comes mostly at the practical side. It comes on how actually to manage this as a single research area and create incentives to actually collaborate between the universities, to physically meet, for example. All those practicalities can be quite daunting, and you actually need to invest a lot of resources only to manage this as a multi-university organization. Adding to that, it's also complicated to act against more than one line organization. It's complicated enough to work with one line organization like Lund University. To work with against two line organization makes it even more daunting, and generates even more meetings and even more people you should network with. And this is said from my point of view, which is then the main partner. Is another problem, of course, if you are the junior partner in a collaboration, that you actually lose some momentum in actually steering the development of the environment.
Any comments?
No, I think you've said it. Yeah.
Let's take another mentee question. How to determine a good balance between basic research and policy relevant publication? Good questions.
Well, it's maybe a slightly different answer, but I'm very interested in the extent to which very basic research can be pulled through into use-inspired application. So it's not so much about the balance, but rather than to see these as separate things that don't relate and that you have to have them going on in different worlds, to look at the opportunity to say, align them not too far from each other so that you can get this pull through. So the example of working on electric propulsion for air flight, for example, you know, it was very interesting that as I say, the material chemists were not ever talking to the engineers and had never joined up their interests. Now that the materials chemists think that they're new materials might be put to use in that context, they're working together really well. But it's still very fundamental work developing new materials. It hasn't changed the fundamental chemistry at all. It's just there's an opportunity here to direct that designing work in chemistry towards this particular application. And I that's what I find as exciting. And so it's not sort of what's the balance, it's saying what's the opportunity here.
The common good that could benefit
that
society.
can come out of it. Yeah, it doesn't have to be, I mean, you don't want to force that, but in this instance, it's such a productive kind of collaboration for new thought, even at the very sort of fundamental end.
Would you like to add? Or should we move on? We have a few more questions. Great. Are we bold enough in defining common agenda with different partners towards the SDGs? Are we bold enough?
Are we bold enough to define the agenda, or are we bold enough to then do something? Writing research agendas is easier. But
I mean, this may be me because I'm not personally having to do it all. I would like my colleagues to be even bolder than they are in terms of, the confidence of the steps they might take towards solving some of these huge challenges. It's very, very difficult to bring together lots of colleagues that think they want to do their own work. And, how do you sort of meld that all together to genuinely be facing into these big, complex challenges? And I would, if I could, I would be pushing them harder.
What stops you?
I'm needing to learn about the process with which you have to iterate those. What have we got? Who have we got? What are our capabilities? What are our interests? What are we prepared to do together? And how do we apply that into the problem? And I'm learning that that's not a simple process, and that it takes time, and it's about the right conditions, the right knowledge sets and applications being able to come together. And so that's kind of what stopped. And people probably aren't used to working in this way. So there's a lot of learning to go on for all of us, me included.
Thank you, Professor Smith.
I'm a little bit unclear what the question really implies, because we are working with setting research agendas across different organizations within academia, and that's pretty simple to do I mean, of course, complex to understand other sciences, and you have to compromise what you want to do sometimes to set common agendas. But if the question is about working with partners outside the university, I think we need to consider very carefully the ethical problems too, because we would like to work closely with society so that our research has an impact, but we also want to maintain the scientific independence and integrity. So we are not working unconditionally with partners outside the universities. We always want to maintain our ability to make our own decisions. And I think this is an area we need in at times where much more, for example, in the Horizon funding is focused on transdisciplinary research. And every researcher will have to go into this to get large research money. I think this is something we need to discuss much, much more, how we maintain our scientific integrity when we are working closely with, for example, industrial partners when it comes to environmental questions.
Thank you, Professor Møller. I'd like to add a question to this one. In terms of working with societal engagement, do we work enough involving other partners? Maybe not corporations or companies, but more civil society in this process of transformation of society that universities do address. Henrik, would you like to answer that one?
I don't think we work enough with it. We need to work much more to find ways to actually communicate our science. There was some discussion before about if papers were cited in policy documents. I wouldn't expect them to be that. I wouldn't expect them to be read even. We need to find a way how we actually synthesize our knowledge across border areas and actually then communicate the border synthesis in a way that is scientifically sound to begin with, but also efficient in terms of being understood by decision makers. I think we need to put a lot more resources into that.
I think it's a really exciting area. I mean, in the Rights Lab, they have citizens looking at satellite images in order to help that analysis. So there's citizen science agendas going on there, working with former government ministers from Brazil to think about population needs in Brazil. You know, so there's a lot going on, but actually it does take a level of resource. It's time consuming, and it does cost money, and it costs money for citizens to participate, actually, particularly less enfranchised citizens. You know, they can't just afford to walk into a university. They need travel costs, they need time out of work. You know, so it's not to be underestimated, but very, very important.
Yes, please.
Obviously, there is a lot of difference between different disciplines in these. At least in Finland, the one big difference is then between the universities and the government research institutes, where the kind of the research institutes, they put a lot of effort. They work under the different ministries, and that's part of their job, kind of communicating then. And they are actually extremely good at that. So here again, that it probably is that it's not the case that every university professor should be doing that half time, but it's that some people are extremely good at that, and then kind of figuring out that what is the good way of organizing this is important.
We are measured on it. Universities in the UK are measured on public engagement, community interaction, business interaction. There's an annual survey, and we are ranked, and we get some funding on the basis of how well we do.
And where could you find these numbers?
Research England, part of the UK Research and Innovation, publish that survey every year. It's called HEBCIS, HEBCIS. And all universities are now going to be part of a knowledge exchange framework. So we will have that published every year in 5 or 6 target plots to show how we're doing. So it's another new way of measuring universities, but it's a good thing.
Let's take one final question. We have 5 more minutes to go. Does specialization in COE constrain mobility between universities, at least nationally and in the long run?
Constrain mobility. I would have thought it's doing the opposite.
It's not an easy question.
Yeah, I would have thought because it's making us expand our activity and recruit individuals, work with each other. I would hope that it does the opposite to constrain mobility.
So the question might refer to the case where there is let's say, the only research group in the country which is looking at a certain thing, which is very relatively limited. But as you pointed out, typically these centers of excellence, they kind of involve people from different disciplines, and in that way they might even make national mobility easier.
There is actually one more question connected to this one, so let's just round this off. As research infrastructures were mentioned briefly, should there be a connection to centers of excellence funding?
I could give what. So our beacons are enabling us to define asks for very large research infrastructures from government, because in 2 of our beacons, they have been very clear about what big infrastructure facility they would want to put at the heart of their work. And because of that, that enables people like me to then start making the case to government for that. And we've got a long way. We haven't quite got them yet, but we certainly have used it to make the case. So one is about ultra high field MRI facility, a national facility, and another one is about a megawatt test facility for electric propulsion, which again, both of those would be the only in Europe of the kind that they are. So fingers crossed that coronavirus doesn't destroy the economy and we won't be able to have them. Yeah.
Well, Henrik, please.
When the Swedish strategic research areas were founded once upon a time, the infrastructure money was deliberately left out of that funding. But still, the research areas in Lund plays a very large role in applying for and maintaining infrastructures. So even if the road is not directed through that funding, the existence of the centers generates an increased ability to actually generate infrastructures and maintain them. I could wish for a more systematic way to approach this, because infrastructure funding in Sweden is becoming more and more complicated, and that requires a sort of university-wide strategy how to handle them. And I see here Stacey looks at me, which is a problem much larger than what the SRAs alone can handle.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for sharing your insights with us and the people watching the livecast. And let's give them all a warm hand of applause to send them off.